During World War II, there were no fiercer rivals in the entire conflict than Adolf Hitler, leader of Germany, and Joseph Stalin, head of the Soviet Union. The brutal battles between the two countries left tens of millions dead, with blood spilled over stretches of thousands of miles. However, the relationship between these powers was not always the same. At the beginning of the war, and despite their diametrically opposed ideologies, they were faithful allies, fighting and invading other countries together. However, both knew that it was only a matter of time before this bond would be torn apart. There was no doubt that blood would flow. The only question was who would strike the first blow, and who would emerge victorious. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the intriguing pact between two of the most sinister figures in history, Stalin and Hitler, from the creation of this alliance to its explosive destruction. A few months before the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, Hitler was preparing to continue his campaign of conquest. Austria and the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia were already in his hands, invaded and annexed without any resistance. The other powers in Europe, mainly the United Kingdom and France, had weakly protested against these operations, but their complaints were ignored by the Führer. The next target of the Third Reich was in the east. It was Poland, a prize much coveted by the Nazi leader, who sought to expand his empire into this territory. But unlike his previous victims, the Poles made it clear that if they dared to cross the border, they would be greeted with a storm of bullets. On this occasion, the British and French also threatened that if the country's sovereignty was endangered, war would be declared. Hitler was not very worried about this scenario, however. He did not believe in the threats from the Allies and thought that even if they were true, his armies would not be able to resist the modern German forces. But there was one aspect of the situation that kept him awake at night. If war began, what would his main enemy, the Soviet Union, do? Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Eurasian giant, asked himself the same question about his rival. He had no doubt about what Nazism thought of him and his people, made up largely of Slavs and Jews. The party's ideology considered them inferior and subhuman, unworthy of sharing the planet with the superior Aryan race. In turn, communism threatened traditional Western values and was a direct path to barbarism. The survival of the German man would only be guaranteed when they were destroyed. War between the two nations was inevitable.
Here we have a popular illustrated history of so-called racial science that was published in Germany in the 1930s. So we have the pure Germanic youth as opposed to the degenerate Jewish youth. On the right-hand side here is a rather crude world map purporting to show revolutions that were instigated by Jews and their associated Freemasons. So we have here, in fact, a perfect illustration of Hitler's view of the Untermensch, the subhuman, conflation of the Jew, the Slav and the communist. These were the very peoples that were now ripe for subjugation and indeed for extermination in Germany's eastward cultural mission.
The territory Hitler wanted could only be obtained through war. Knowing this, Stalin tried to negotiate treaties with the United Kingdom and France to achieve a defensive alliance, guaranteeing that if one was invaded, the others would come to its aid. But these agreements never came about. The Soviets suspected that the Allies wanted the Russians and Germans to engage in a long and costly war, leaving the rest of Europe free of hostilities. For his part, Hitler did not want such an alliance to be cemented, as he feared facing a two-front war. That is why he resorted to a plan as desperate as it was surprising. He would establish a pact with his greatest enemy before any other treaty could be made. Thus began the rapprochement between the foreign ministers of Germany, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and of the Soviet Union, Vyacheslav Molotov. To the surprise of many, who perhaps expected that the negotiations between these rivals would not prosper, they were carried out very quickly. On August 23, 1939, with the approval of their respective heads of state, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. It guaranteed 10 years of peace between the two countries. In this way, Hitler could invade Poland and even engage in a war with the Allies without risk of Soviet intervention. For his part, Stalin would have time to organize his Red Army for the conflict against the Germans, which, despite the treaty, he still believed impossible to avoid.
In the Kremlin, Stalin proposed a toast.
I know how much the German nation loves its Führer. I should therefore like to drink his health.
But like Hitler, Stalin was also acting from fear that Hitler would attack him. That evening, he told his inner circle,
Of course, it's all a game to see who can fool whom. He thinks he's outsmarted me, but actually it's I who's tricked him.
But there was a secret clause in the pact. According to it, Eastern Europe would be divided into two regions, one under German rule and the other controlled by the communists. Stalin demanded Finland, the Baltic states, and a large part of Romania. The rest could fall into Nazi hands. Poland, for its part, would be torn apart and divided between the two, with each keeping half. After the assurance of successful negotiations, Hitler set his plans in motion again. On the 1st of September 1939, just 8 days after the signing of the treaty, German soldiers crossed the border into Poland, thus beginning the Second World War. The defenders could do little against the tanks and a much larger, better trained and equipped German army. Although the British and French kept their promise and declared war on the Reich, they did not send men, and the Poles were forced to retreat further and further into their own territory. The battle seemed lost. The defenders believed that the situation could not get any worse, but they were wrong. On September 17th, everything went out of control. From the other end of the country, the Red Army also invaded Poland. The locals, confused by the new enemy, in many cases did not even open fire as the Soviets advanced into the heart of the nation. On October 6th, just over a month after the attack began, the Polish forces were completely defeated by this lethal alliance. Both conquerors began their processes of terror against the civilian population. Members of the German SS massacred tens of thousands of Poles, most of them of Jewish origin, in just a few weeks. They were not the only ones. Stalin ordered the same to be done. This happened, for example, in the Katyn massacre, a series of mass murders that ended the lives of more than 20,000 people. All of them, belonging to the intellectual, political, and military spheres of Poland, were shot in cold blood. It was not until 1943 that the macabre mass graves where their bodies were buried would be discovered. For the nations of the West, this scenario was completely hopeless. Stalin and Hitler seemed to be staunch partners, ready to deploy their territorial ambitions to the rest of Europe. And although the Soviet leader had not declared war on the United Kingdom or France, he could not be counted on to mutually destroy the Führer, as had been the original plan of the Allies. According to some members of the German leadership, the Nazi leader was confident of Soviet loyalty. But the truth is that Stalin wasted no time in fortifying his positions, preparing for a German invasion that he still considered inevitable. He began to mobilize his forces towards the countries that had been under his sphere of influence, according to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, with the aim of creating zones that would act as a barrier against Germany. The Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were forced to choose between peaceful or violent annexation. All three decided not to take up arms. Finland, on the other hand, offered fierce resistance, and on November 30th, 1939, the Winter War began. After 3 months, the Finns had to surrender, and although they ceded territory to the Soviet Union, the country was not conquered in its entirety. Stalin had not achieved his objective, and during the brutal conflict, the Red Army lost around 125,000 soldiers. This was not the first time that the world had witnessed the incompetence of the communist forces, whose most experienced generals had been shot under Stalin's orders in the previous years, during the Great Purge that began in 1936. Although in theory they were his allies, Hitler was glad for the blood shed by the Russians. The Führer ended up convincing himself that, when the time came for their elimination, they would not pose a real danger to the Third Reich. But for the moment, his objectives were different. On May 10, 1940, the German army launched a massive invasion of its western neighbors. France, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg were attacked simultaneously. Despite all the defensive preparations they had made, within just 6 weeks, they were defeated and their countries conquered. British forces, which had been sent to assist their allies, were eventually driven off the continent, but not before suffering terrible casualties. With the French surrender, the United Kingdom became the only force still standing, opposing the rule of the Third Reich. For the Nazis, this was a huge triumph. For Stalin, it was terrible news.
Nikita Khrushchev, later Russia's prime minister, recalled Stalin's reaction to Hitler's lightning victories.
I remember being with Stalin. He was extremely nervous. He was racing around, cursing like a cab driver. He cursed the French. He cursed the English. How could they allow Hitler to defeat them, to crush them? Stalin not only saw the superiority of the German army, he knew that the Germans sensed our weakness because of the war we had fought with Finland.
Stalin wanted the Western nations to destroy each other in a devastating war, but the swift German victory shattered his hopes. With no strong enemy in the West, he knew it was only a matter of time before Hitler's ambitious eyes would turn to the east. But his armies were not ready to deal with the powerful Nazi war machine. They needed more time. In those moments of doubt, he received a letter from the then British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. In the message, he urged an alliance between their countries, appealing to what they both knew. The Soviet Union would be the new target of Nazism. Stalin, however, decided to demonstrate his loyalty to the Führer and informed him of the Englishman's intentions. But this turned out to be a huge mistake. After France's crushing defeat, Hitler was surprised that the United Kingdom had not tried to negotiate peace with Germany. Added to this was the fact that Franklin Roosevelt, upon being re-elected President of the United States, denounced German ideology in his acceptance speech. The Nazi leader felt that these two countries would be the core of a new alliance, created in order to defeat his forces. The revelation that the Soviet Union had been invited to join only cemented his suspicions. If Stalin accepted, his position would no longer be so weak, and he would be able to stand up to the powerful German army. Thus, Hitler came to a brutal conclusion. The communists had to be crushed immediately. However, other campaigns in the Western theater of operations, such as the Air Battle of England, kept him busier than he would have liked. By early 1941, however, his plans were already in motion. Although the United Kingdom was still in the war, the Führer thought it was no risk, and despite Roosevelt's fiery speeches, the United States still remained neutral. It was time for Nazi Germany's most ambitious operation, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Stalin received numerous reports from his spies, warning him of troop movements on the German border. Even Churchill himself shared similar reports from his own agents, but the communist leader chose to ignore them. He did not think that the Reich's forces would get involved in a two-front war, so he maintained that as long as the United Kingdom remained steadfast in the conflict, its territory would be safe. But his way of thinking was not the same as that of his rival.
Stalin was trusting Hitler to act rationally. And to fight Britain and Russia at the same time was clearly irrational. But Stalin failed to realize that despite their similarities, there was one profound difference between him and Hitler, which made his perfect logic irrelevant. He himself was a methodical, calculating, hard-working man, a master of detail, personally signing death lists at one extreme, and at the other, keeping the tiniest details of gold production in his notebook. Hitler, by contrast, was at heart an idle dreamer.
On June 22, 1941, Hitler ordered the start of Operation Barbarossa. From the Finnish border in the north to the Romanian border in the south, Axis forces invaded the Soviet Union on a scale never before seen. Stalin, who thought he had more time to prepare his men, was surprised by the brutality of his former ally. Within days, tanks advanced hundreds of miles inland, destroying everything in their path. Entire villages were burned, along with all their inhabitants, while German planes dropped tons of explosives on the cities. Within weeks, Soviet deaths reached terrifying numbers. Stalin, a victim of fear and fury, ordered the execution of some of the generals in charge of the initial defense. Clearly, this did not improve his dire situation. The German officers, witnessing the disorganization and chaos that reigned in the Russian ranks, considered the campaign to be short-lived. Some informed Hitler that they would be at the gates of Moscow in 4 months at the most. Others spoke of only 2 weeks. The Führer was happy with the way events were unfolding. He no longer had to pretend to be an ally of a people and an ideology that he saw as inferior. He also believed that, once the Soviet Union was crushed, the United Kingdom would be quick to sign a peace treaty, since German supremacy would be demonstrated, and if they did not do so, the resources that would be taken from the communists, such as steel and oil sources, would allow Churchill to be defeated as well. But there was an unforeseen event in the German plans. With their armies engaged in a war against the Soviets, the British could go on the offensive. And so they did in North Africa, where fighting between the Allies and their enemies was still ongoing. The German situation worsened even more when, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. This was the spark the Americans needed to ignite their fighting spirit, and they finally joined the war against the Axis forces. Meanwhile, the Red Army, despite its initial disasters, was proving to be a more feared enemy than expected. Stalin and his generals managed to quickly mobilize reserves of men, and despite the terrible casualties suffered, there were still fighters ready to face the invaders. They also managed to move their heavy industries from the western cities beyond the Ural Mountains. In this way, the resources the Germans so craved were kept out of their reach, and the locals were able to continue building the war material necessary to fight. After 4 months, the deadline that several German officers had set as the maximum point of Russian resistance, they had not been able to meet almost any of their objectives. Moscow remained firmly in Soviet hands, and now a patriotic fervor circulated in the men and women of the Union. Everyone would do their part to eliminate the Nazi aggressors.
Некоторые перепуганы интеллигентики. Не так страшен черт, как его малюют. Кто может отрицать, то наша Красная Армия не раз обращал политическое бегство в слоеные немецкие войска. Если судить не по фастинг за армином немецких пропагандистов, а по действительному доложению, Германии нетрудно будет понять, что немецко-фашистские захватчики стоят перед катастрофой.
With the entry of the United States into the conflict, the main axis of the anti-Nazi resistance was formed, made up of Americans, British, and Soviets. In this way, Hitler ended up being the cause of creating the alliance that he so feared, and which led him to betray his former partner. Beginning in 1942, with the joint operations of the Western powers and the Communists, the German situation only worsened. While German morale and resources rapidly diminished, Soviet fighting spirit continued to increase. When the invaders tried to conquer Stalingrad in the middle of that year, their forces were devastated by the resistance of the defenders. Hitler, suffering from a shortage of soldiers and equipment, was forced to order a retreat. In the following years, all the territory they had conquered was liberated until the fighting reached German soil itself. The Führer, cornered and desperate, succumbed to his paranoia, which ended up taking him to the grave in April 1945. Two rising powers with expansionist ambitions meet in Berlin. The German capital watches as the emissaries from Asia arrive at the Third Reich Chancellery. There, Adolf Hitler himself awaits representatives of the powerful Empire of Japan to seal a pact. The signing would make them allies, but that friendship was nothing more than a mirage. The Führer's plans had hidden agendas, where loyalty was a mere illusion. War was about to break out, and it would be accompanied by betrayals. In this new installment of military history, we delve into the fragile alliance of Nazis and Japanese, what they thought of each other, why they united for a common purpose, and how distrust transformed into a cruel stab in the back. On November 25, 1936, representatives of Germany and Japan faced each other in a diplomatically rigid confrontation. The objective was to sign a pact that, in theory, would seal an alliance against the growing threat of the Soviet Union. This treaty, known as the Agreement Against the Communist International, reflected a shared vision of expansion and domination. However, it also marked the beginning of a series of betrayals and disagreements that, in turn, would mark the course of World War II. Despite its apparent strength, the bond between Berlin and Tokyo was more fragile than many might think. Although the two countries had many political and military affinities, the reality is that they never behaved as true allies. Adolf Hitler viewed the Japanese with contempt and fear. For him, they were a people incapable of innovating on their own, destined to follow in the footsteps of the Aryan race or fall into decline. But when geopolitics imposed its rules, the Führer was forced to swallow his words and feign courtesy. Despite his racism, he grudgingly admired the ferocity of the Japanese soldiers. Thus was born the myth of the honorary Aryans. Even though Asians were never treated as equals by the Third Reich. Thus, the alliance was a pact based on hypocrisy. The Nazis saw the Japanese as a necessary evil, a partner they would use as long as it served their interests. Meanwhile, in the midst of the process of modernization and opening up to the West, the Asians based their own civil code on the German model. They respected and admired them. They also used the organization of the Prussian army as an example to structure the imperial troops. However, beyond the two having very different visions, the fundamental point of their alliance was the existence of a common enemy, Russia. Following victory in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, Tokyo consolidated its position as an emerging power. Even so, tensions with the Soviet Union remained simmering for decades. Nazi ideology, with its marked anti-communism, made Germany the ideal partner for the Empire of the Rising Sun. However, what initially seemed destined to be a firm friendship soon showed signs of cracks. The rift began when Japan, convinced that Hitler would support it, increased hostilities along the Soviet border. During the massacre in China, the Japanese had conquered the region of Manchuria. There they formed a state called Manchukuo, governed by Tokyo. In 1932, they delimited their borders along the Khalkha River. This caused tensions with not just one, but two neighbors. To the north lay the main objective: the abundant natural resources of Siberia and the Soviet Far East. But to the west, there were also problems. as Mongolia disagreed with the territorial boundaries that had been established. In 1936, the Russians and Mongolians signed a mutual cooperation agreement. This obligated each party to come to the aid of the other in the event of aggression by a third party. Thus, the growing rivalry with the Soviet Union led the Empire of Japan to end up fighting against the forces of both countries. The first time was in 1938 at the Battle of Lake Khasan on Russian soil. There was no clear winner, and the confrontation ended in what was considered a draw. However, on the night of May 10, 1939, a new crossing began. And this time, the outcome would be very different. About 80 Mongolian People's Army cavalrymen crossed the border into Manchukuo under the pretext of foraging for their horses. At dawn, they were spotted by Japanese cavalrymen who charged the intruders and drove them back, causing heavy casualties. But that was only the beginning. The imperial government demanded an apology that never came and decided to act accordingly. They were going to show their neighbors who they were messing with. But not everything turned out as they imagined. During June and August 1939, the Japanese mobilized 75,000 men, 135 tanks, and about 250 aircraft across the Khalkhin River. However, on the other side were not only Mongolian warriors. The Soviet Union had arrived with reinforcements, deploying 57,000 troops, 500 tanks, and 800 aircraft. The battle was brutal. With the battlefield stained with blood, the Japanese were convinced that the Nazi forces would soon unite to fight a common enemy. However, they were once again mistaken. Hitler and his men never arrived, and the Imperial Army suffered one of its worst military defeats in history. But as if this were not enough, another blow was about to strike Tokyo. While its troops were being massacred fighting the Soviet leaders' soldiers in Europe, the beginning of another war was brewing. One that would cover the entire world in its shadow. Behind it stood the Führer, who, far from aiding his military partner, focused on his own interests. At the same time that the Asians were healing their wounds, and were forced to reconsider their approach to war, they were shaken by the unexpected. Without warning or consultation, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact on August 23, 1939. Just days after the brutal battle at Khalkhin. For Japan, this represented a blatant betrayal by its supposed ally, which not only abandoned its anti-communist commitment, but also established secret agreements to divide territories in Eastern Europe. The news of the so-called Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was greeted with dismay in Tokyo. Japanese diplomacy was left in an awkward position and had to rethink its strategies. As a result, the conflict with the Soviet Union froze, and Japan began to turn its attention towards Southeast Asia and the Pacific. However, Japan wasn't the only one surprised by Hitler and Stalin's rapprochement. The non-aggression pact perplexed the other Western powers, who considered it unnatural from the Nazi point of view. However, the reason for this strange union could be explained by the needs of each signatory. On the one hand, the Third Reich needed to ensure peace on the Eastern Front for the duration of the war that was about to break out. On the other, the Soviets were looking for a powerful ally to break out of international isolation, and they also didn't want to confront the fearsome Germany. Adolf Hitler's success in Western Europe had a profound impact on Japan. Asians saw how the Nazis' blitzkrieg contrasted with their situation, and they found themselves at a standstill in their incursion into China. However, Tokyo refused to resign itself to its expansionist vision and sought to emulate the Germans despite the betrayal. On September 22, 1940, while France was occupied by the forces of the Third Reich, the Imperial Japanese Army invaded French Indochina. Thus began Japan's conquest of the region under the guise of liberating Southeast Asia from European colonial rule. The reality was that its intention to expand into the Soviet Union had been a failure. But by shifting the focus of its war strategy, it was also able to put the German betrayal behind it, and signed another agreement in Berlin on September 27, 1940. This time, both powers added Italy to form the tripartite pact, formalizing the existing cooperation and finally shaping the Axis. Everything seemed to indicate that the resentments had disappeared. But what Hitler didn't know was that a new betrayal was brewing behind his back. While World War II progressed on various fronts, Japanese Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka was negotiating the signing of a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. The agreement was finally reached in April 1941, repeating what had already happened, but in reverse. By then, the Führer and his generals were finalizing preparations for Operation Barbarossa. A full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union launched on June 22nd of that same year. The Empire of Japan had not been informed, nor had it been offered the opportunity to participate in a joint mission. The lack of coordination, as well as the suspicion that existed between the two powers, became increasingly evident. And in December 1941, it found a new expression: the attack on Pearl Harbor. The bombing of the U.S. naval base caused the American giant to officially enter the war, radically changing the fate of the conflict. Washington's need to focus its resources on a battle in the Pacific favored the Nazis. This way, it would not provide support to the British or Soviets to fight Germany on the European fronts. Still, Hitler would need Japan's help to defeat Stalin, as the Red Army vehemently resisted. For this reason, the Führer decided to make a gesture toward his ally and declared war on the Americans. He hoped that with this support, Tokyo would break its agreement with the Soviets and join the fight from Siberia to divide the opposing troops. However, that never happened. It is true that for a moment in 1942, the war seemed to be tilting in favor of the Axis. German tanks advanced toward the Caucasus and the Middle East, while the Japanese Navy advanced into the waters of Australia and India. But what sounded like an imminent victory turned out to be just a mirage. The Third Reich was trapped in the devastating Russian winter at Stalingrad, where its Sixth Army was annihilated. Meanwhile, Japan suffered irretrievable losses in the Pacific after the Battle of Midway. The lack of coordination, the depletion of resources, and the industrial superiority of the Allies marked the beginning of the end for the German-Japanese Union. By 1945, the Axis was on the verge of collapse. Germany fell in May, while Japan held out until August, when the devastating atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki sealed its surrender. The Soviet Union, which until then had maintained relative peace with the Japanese, broke the non-aggression pact in its final days and launched an invasion of Manchuria, contributing to the final surrender of the empire. Thus ended an alliance that, despite its apparent strength, never consolidated into true military cooperation. The history of Germany and Japan in World War II was not that of two inseparable partners, but of two nations with distinct ambitions that, despite sharing enemies, never managed to trust each other. And now, after exploring the conflictive relationship between these two powers in the deadliest war in history, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us. See you in the next installment of Military History.